Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to be talking about cocaine distribution and also the narco states that we read a lot about. My guest today is an expert on these topics. My guest is Dr. William Marcy, who is a lecturer at Buffalo State University. Dr. Marcy has authored two books, one, The Politics of Cocaine, and his most recent is titled Narcostates. Dr. Marcy, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much. How are you?
Fine. I appreciate you being with me today.
Thank you.
Earlier you wrote a book, Politics of Cocaine. Which areas were you covering we won't go through all of them, just generally speaking.
Well, it's part of the first book. This is The Politics of Cocaine.
Right.
Dealt with the Andean region and the Central America, and how the conflation of the Cold War became part of the war on drugs, particularly in dealing with the Sendero Luminoso or the FARC, and the ELN, for example. These are revolutionary organizations in Colombia.
Right, exactly. Okay, and then the narco states, your second book.
The AUC, I should say, as well.
Okay, and then narco states, you're talking mostly about Central America and Mexico. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yes. So this picks up where it's basically parts of my research that I had to fill in and complete as I went along. So here's narco states, and it was deals with Mexico and basically how the Mexicans at the end of this Central American Civil War. I mean, again, Central America played a huge role in the movement of the Colombians into Central America. But at the end of the Central American Civil War, there was such instability, and at the same time, the major Colombian cartels collapsed, and the Mexicans moved in. And in the middle, being pushed out because of their narco war, the Mexican government, pressing its war against the Mexican cartels. So then they took advantage of Central America as a springboard towards the United States.
I see. And that was mostly in the mid-90s, from about 92 to 96, primarily. Is that when that happened, roughly?
Well, yeah, 1992, 1996, yes, this is exactly when the wars were winding down, particularly in Central America. And so there is problems in those countries. I mean, again, the whole problem of creating institutions and policing, and that was a very large challenge. So that's in narco states, dealing with the problems of trying to develop counter narcotics police. And of course, the Colombians cartels had decentralized, and the Mexicans basically took over control of the shipment, but they still were moving drugs up towards Mexico, which then the Mexicans took over and then brought into the United States. So again, it depends. It's kind of what after the collapse of the Cali and Medellin cartels, many of the Colombian cartels decentralized, and that's when the Mexicans stepped in and really took over, particularly under Amado Carrillo Fuentes.
Right. Now, the cartels, we hear a lot about the cartels, and we hear a lot about how we can combat the cartels and that type of thing.
Yeah.
Some people are pushing towards the militarization. We're even hearing where the Trump administration is thinking about invading Mexico, which would be a violation of international law. But how does this militarization work? It strikes me as being someone who's somewhat away from the issue. The militarization doesn't seem to work very well, does it, or does it?
Well, as far as I can see, it does not. If we look at the situation, I mean, again, it depends. In Plan Colombia, for example, or even the Merida Initiative, I mean, I have statistics of murder rates being extremely high as a result of the Merida Initiative, and that was in Mexico. And one of the big problems for Central America was that it was caught between Plan Colombia as well as the Merida Initiative, which then pushed crime deeper into Central America, where it had never really existed before. And so, again, the murder rates in Mexico were extremely high. And again, some people, I make the comparison. It wasn't necessarily as bad as the Mexican Revolution, but I mean, again, you could see that. And so one of the big problems is that this is, it becomes, the Kingpin Strategy, which you mentioned previously. Again, you're going after the heads of the cartels, but then they, of course, take radical measures to fight back. And of course, there's, one of the big problems is dealing with that situation. I mean, again, because they're very powerful and they can influence and corrupt governments as well. So how do you deal with that? But at the same time, you have to have institutions that are able to counter the power of the cartels. And that's a big problem, right?
Yeah, most assuredly, yes, it certainly is. Yeah, that I remember back when we were talking about with the various criminals and what have you. Bill Clinton, he deported quite a few folks under the MS-13. I guess they went back to Honduras and El Salvador. I don't remember the Central American countries exactly.
It's Northern Triangle primarily.
Northern Triangle, and then
Yeah, there'd
the
be
guy,
Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras.
Honduras, right? I see. Yes, right. Yeah, and would that how would that work today? I'm sure we're going to be deporting some criminals, no doubt about that. But I doubt it's going to be 100,000. But I may be wrong on that. But
Well, I mean,
what's the best strategy to deal with these people who are involved in the drug trade that we capture?
well, I mean, they imprisonment for them, but I mean, again,
Right.
in deportations of criminals for the United States, I mean, again, one of the big issues is, of course, when Clinton deported all those gang members, it created a crime wave in those countries. And that's something the
Mhm.
United States needs to consider when it begins deporting criminals now, is that we need to make sure that, for example, when they were let off, the MS-13 members were let off in El Salvador, they were just dropped off at the airport and, made their way into San Salvador. And, nobody was there to pick them up. I mean, they were just basically on their own. So, I mean, again, if they're actually legitimate criminals, we better notify those governments that they're, being criminals sent to them, and so that they can deal with them, because otherwise you might have another crime wave. So it's something the United States needs to think about ahead of time, is to prepare for a potential, if we're deporting criminals, that those countries are prepared to take control over those criminals when they do arrive. Otherwise you have, the instability that occurred in Central America between 2010 and, 2020. And then that led to, mass migration because the countries were destabilized. I mean, now people entering the United States aren't necessarily from the Northern Triangle anymore, but I mean, again, it played a very large role, the crime wave in those countries that led to them migrating north, and then the migrant caravans towards the United States.
And so often we see news stories about these vicious tattoo-laden criminals in the Honduras and El Salvador, and the Central Americans are very happy to remind us that we were the ones who trained them to be that way, because we put them in jail, most of them out in California, and they learned the best techniques on how to be criminals and to run illegal activities and that type of thing. So it's not just a matter of getting them out of here. We've got to figure out what's going to happen to them in the future.
Well, yeah, we don't want recidivism. I mean, again, one of the problems, of course, is economic for these countries. And again, the transfer between industrialization and agriculture for those countries, I cover that as well, especially in Central America, led to youth members, because again, people moved into the cities, and those kids at the time had no opportunities, and the gangs provided an opportunity to them. So again, one of the big problems is Bukele has jailed so many and he's very popular for getting control over his country. So you can't say that Bukele's failed, but how long can you permanently keep, people incarcerated and under lock and key? I mean, he's not going to be president of El Salvador forever. And will they want to maintain a state of emergency forever in that country? And it's it is a question that to consider, if they can maintain, stability, and particularly make these people productive elements within society.
Right.
I mean, some of them are very violent. I mean, they practice
exactly.
Santa Muerte.
Yeah. Most assuredly, yeah. Yeah. If you could you focus on that? You're talking about the president of El Salvador, right?
Yeah, Nayib
Yes.
Bukele, yes.
Give us a little background information on him and how he came into power and what he's done.
Well, the book doesn't necessarily focus on him specifically and how he came to power, but I mean, again, he promised to get law and order, because again, what had happened during the presidency in El Salvador, I think it was Funes who made a peace deal with the gangs in the jails, and basically they took over control over the jails in El Salvador, and that became a means by which they could run their operations from jail, and that was a big problem. And so and it spread out into the cities, and San Salvador and everything, and it became very dangerous. And as a result of this, the police, and then there were even at one point there was death squads reappearing in Central America to take out the gang members, and like they had during the Central American Civil War. So it all kind of ties back to the Central American Civil War. And as a result of this, he promised law and order, which he has achieved. But I mean, El Salvador is very stable, but of course, this is how long can El Salvador afford and be able to maintain the incarceration of mass numbers of people in order to make it stable?
Mhm.
So that's,
Yeah.
a long-term question that needs to be thought about.
Yeah. As I recall, he was elected as a progressive, and then he came in, and of course, there was so much violence and
Yeah,
crime and what happened in El Salvador. So they just started doing extrajudicial arrests, putting people in jail and that type of thing, depriving them of their human rights, civil rights, constitutional rights, and that type of thing. And yet he still seems to be fairly popular, is he not?
he is. But I mean, again, they have done the mano dura. Is another thing that I cover, and every country, in the Northern Triangle, had it's called the heavy hand. So this was
I,
1990s, 2000s. They had the 2000s. They developed this mano dura policies. Even in Panama, they had a form of mano dura, a plan escoba in Guatemala. But I mean, it didn't go far enough, and so he had to really take extraordinary measures in order to get his country stable. I mean, again, basically suspending constitutional norms in order to arrest them. So
exactly.
I mean, so again, that's kind of a problem, of course, in the long term, right?
Sure. I'm just curious, this is a little bit off topic, but did cryptocurrency ever come into your study? Did you follow up with him on
Well,
that?
I
Because,
have. There is, I
yes,
mean, cryptocurrency is a means of laundering money,
right.
but not necessarily Bitcoin, because it's all traceable. So what they do with currency is that they find ways like using property or luxury items, and then they convert the cryptocurrency into those things, and then that's how they wash their money. And even still in Panama, there's different means by laundering money, and it still goes on. For example, dollar discounting, which is a means of selling dollars at a discount and purchasing foreign, colones, for example, and then you can, get an exchange, favorable to the dollar discounter, and then they're able to launder their money that way. Or, false invoicing, and, just bringing in goods to Panama, and those goods can be, exchanged into other, say there's worth so much, but there's only so much on there, and so you're just creating a false invoice, right? And that's another way. So it
Well,
still goes on.
oh yes, yes. Well, we're going to come back and talk about that in just a moment. But you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved in a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you have a podcast, or you just have a computer, you like our show and you would like to share it, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today, we're taking a look at this whole situation, this whole issue of narco states, and my guest is an expert on this topic. Dr. William Marcy, lecturer at Buffalo State University, authored two books, The Politics of Cocaine, and his most recent book is Narcostates. Dr. Marcy, we're talking about the Central American area primarily right now, and so often we'll hear, especially the Central American authorities say, well, it's a matter of supply and demand. Sure, we're poor countries. We have the supply here, but we don't have the demand. The demand is coming from North America. It's coming from the United States. And they're saying, if we didn't have so many people who were so dependent upon drugs in a variety of forms, we wouldn't really have a problem. We wouldn't have a market. How did you address that issue in your book?
Well, in my first book, more so than in the second book, in The Politics of Cocaine, I deal with the question of alternate development programs and, for example, in supply side strategies, for example, coca eradication. And again, the Mexicans will argue, for example, in narcostates, I do say, that the guns, American guns, travel across their border. I mean, I think Claudia Scheinbaum, recently made that comment. And that's a problem for Mexico. And at the same time, so that is used. I mean, for example, you even have the problem of Fast and Furious, for example, and that's where the United States was gun walking weapons to try to follow Los Zetas cartel, and so that's covered in the book. So again, one of the big problems is America needs to deal with education as well as demand reduction programs, but at the same time considering a supply side as well. And the problem is America has lost interest in Latin America to a large extent over the last years. I've heard some of your other guests say that previously, and that's 100% true. And because we've been off in spending money in wars that are very unnecessary to a large extent, and not helping develop institutions, and we've lost track. I mean, it's almost like the Alliance for Progress for something. We kind of lose. Alliance for Progress just lost its way, and that seems like America's interest in Latin America often is not consistent. It's very incoherent. And so that's one of the big problems. There's no consistency between presidencies, and as a result of this, we lose interest in Latin America, and then that's kind of what happened in the 1990s. That's why the cartels grew so big and powerful, is that we were off, first getting involved in the Iraq wars, and then lost interest in Latin America to a large extent.
Yeah, and the folks, the foreign policy people, will argue, I think correctly, that every area of the world is extremely important. But what could be more important than the people in your backyard? I mean, the folks in Central America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and we just have it's been benign neglect in some cases. And even back before that, when we had gunboat diplomacy, we were down there and forcing ourselves on a variety of people who didn't want us down there, to be honest. But that is an extremely important area, and one we really need to pay more attention to. There's no doubt about it. Now, you mentioned President Claudia Scheinbaum,
yes,
and the new incoming president of Mexico. What do you think what role will she play as far as dealing with the cartels, as far as dealing with deporting criminals to Mexico, if we can do that, which I'm not sure she's going to let us, to be quite. In fact, I'm not sure a lot of them are Mexicans. The cartel people are, but I'm not sure that some of the other people would classify as criminals. But what role do you think she'll play?
Well, I think, again, there'll be tariffs, threats of tariffs placed upon Mexico. And it's kind of what happened previously, is that, again, to secure the border, resources were taken away from combating the cartels. But again, this is kind of the problem. Mexico doesn't really have the resources. And again, the institutions, there's a great deal of corruption within Mexico. And to deal with that, at the state and even in the national level, I mean, historically, Mexico has had and even in the security sector of the police, and the national, the AFI, for example, which is the narcotics, they've had corruption. So again, really trying to create a stable, institution within Mexico that will then be able to challenge the cartels, or at least, to keep them tampered down, and at the same time maintain the border, is a very difficult situation facing Scheinbaum. I mean, again, trying to stop the movement of the flow of drugs and people is the biggest concern right now, and it's become a hot topic issue. And again, a lot of it's driven by the war on drugs to a large extent.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But she's in a very difficult spot without having the final. Again, we had the Merida Initiative, but now we've kind of that's no longer there, and that was increasing the military in Mexico and dealing with the cartels, but that led to a crime wave, a violent crime wave. And will the Mexicans really want to go through that? I mean, again, AMLO wanted hugs, not bullets, and she might pursue the same strategy, hugs, not bullets, as well. But again, is that really successful? Again, because the cartels, you can see what's going on in Mexico.
You mentioned AMLO, Manuel Lopez Obrador, who is the former president, the one who preceded her.
Yes, and I'm sorry, I didn't spell out his full name.
That's fine, no problem. But he was pretty much involved in some of the corruption himself, was he not?
Well, not to the extent that you've had. I mean, not him personally involved in the narcotics trade at all. I mean, there's no evidence of that. But Peña Nieto, I mean, there's allegations against him. I mean, you can go back to the Salinas administration. to the Echeverria. There's allegations that he, had connections to the narcotics trade. But I mean, again, you could different like leaders like Coelho in the 90s. It was Coelho Trejo, Gutierrez Robello. These are the heads of the security forces in Mexico. And then you have, for example, more recently, Genaro Garcia Luna, who was a director of narcotics in Mexico. I mean, they were deeply involved in being involved in the drug trade, taking money and looking the other way, or basically facilitating the drug trade. And or another person of the SIU in Mexico, which is the drug unit in Mexico is a drug unit. Ivan Reyes Azarte is another person that got involved. So I mean, you do have this problem of corruption, which really rooting it out is extremely hard to do, because I would make the case that in the book I point out the PRI control the drug trade, and then you have Vicente Fox becomes president, the PAN takes power, which is the Action Nacional Party of Mexico, and then that's really when the drug war really heated up, became much more violent in Mexico, and then you have Felipe Calderon, and that's when it just the Merida Initiative, and it really just blew up in Mexico. So I mean, again, this is kind of the problem, is that you don't really want to go in and start sending in the military and just heat things up. I mean, you have to address it, economically and institutionally as well.
Yeah, that would be a drastic mistake on the part of the United States to even think about that.
Oh yeah, well, Mexico, look how it went for the raid on Pancho Villa. I mean, Mexico didn't really like that.
Yeah, we don't have a real great track record at that.
Punitive expedition, it almost led to war. So I mean, again, American troops wandering around Mexico. We could only do things unless the Mexican government goes along with it, and they are willing to go along with it. But again, it's a poor. I mean, it's not richest country in the world, and they do trade with the United States. I think they want to trade with the United States because you have to develop their economy as well. They are our neighbor.
Sure. Yeah, that's very true, and our second largest trading partner too, as I recall. They're absolutely critical. Yeah. Well, let me ask you, what would you recommend?
We don't want them dumping in the United States either. And that's
exactly right. Yeah, there are a lot of issues to deal with. Yeah. That's for sure.
And it all ties to the drug trade. I mean, it's just amazing how everything is so connected. So I'm sorry.
Sure. Yeah. What recommendations would you make to President Scheinbaum and President Trump as far as helping to clear up this situation, or make it better, improve it, let's say?
Well, I think I've been hinting at it all throughout. I mean, again, institution building, cooperation, definitely trying to root out corruption. I mean, that's part of the institution building, education and demand reduction, and ending, making sure people are productive. You put them in jail, for narcotics or whatever. We'll make sure that they're, don't go back into recidivism. I mean, some of the hardcore cartel members like El Chapo, I mean, he did some really brutal things. I mean, it's very hard to, forgive them for what they just, were ruthless. And so at the same time, Kingpin doesn't necessarily work, though. That's the problem, is if we look at the Mexican cartels and how they've evolved, is that the minute you take out a leader, they break in half. So now what has happened with, for example, the Sinaloa cartel, and this is the problem, you have the El Mayo faction, or the Maitos, Mayo Flaco faction, and then you have the Chapitos, and they are, going at it. And, so the point is that the minute you take out a leader, you're going to have other baby cartels emerged out. So I would say that you have a new fourth generation cartels beginning to emerge. And again, that's, you're never going to, by rooting them out, by killing the leader, you're going to have other cartel members appear. And so that's something they have to consider as well, and so again, what attracts people to it, and that's kind of.
Exactly. Yes. And we're talking about tens to maybe hundreds of billions of dollars involved, at least tens of billions of
25,
dollars.
About 25.
How much? 25 billion?
Annually.
Is that what it is? Yeah. Really? Yeah. And that's a tremendous incentive for people to get involved in it and to take some really major risks, a lot of chances that could pay off, or they could get killed, or whatever the case might be. But you also hit on it a moment ago, and I think you're right, or on all these, but the one is the demand. We have to work harder at reducing the demand in this country for these drugs. And I'm not talking about putting people in jail. I'm talking about educating them and that type
Yeah,
of
yeah.
thing, or incentivizing approaches to get them off drugs or not even get into it. But it's getting so that even grade school kids it seems like can buy drugs. It's really frightening to think about it. But this book is very illuminating, very enlightening, and I hope that our leaders take a look at it and pay attention to it. But
It is.
but we
It is frightening.
yes, it
Oh,
is.
well, I'm
Yes.
just going to say it is frightening. I mean, but you know, if you look at what happened, for example, in legalization in Portland, there was really basically they really kind of blew it because they allowed squatters to do drugs in the streets and they had allowed homeless to do whatever they want, and that turned into a nightmare. Through the people who argue legalization is the answer. And again, this is kind of, you know, we don't. America has to decide whether they want these very strong narcotics. You know, I mean, heroin and cocaine, which are addictive, very hardcore addictive drugs, you know, whether we want to legalize them or not. And again, we want people having easy access to something like that. And of course,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
and
Well, this is something we're not going to resolve today, that's
no,
for sure.
no.
But
And the
but
demand,
Doctor,
yeah, all right, I'm sorry.
the demand is there. It is. But Dr. Marcy, I want to thank
But
you so
supply, I
very
was just
much.
going to say supply side needs to be addressed at the same time, you know, because supply creates its own demand if we follow Say's law. I mentioned that at the end of my book. You know, again, if you have supply, you're going to have demand, and that's kind of you know, so it's kind of a little bit give both sides.
You have to deal with both sides. That's true. Yes. Very true. Well, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it very much.
My pleasure.
I mean, just you can go so many directions.
Exactly.
You know, I don't have all the answers, and I'll admit that. Right.
Well, this is a complex topic. But anyway, thank you so much. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.